Okay, good morning. It's good to be back. It's been, 2 weeks since we've been here, so it's good to be back to see you guys. It's been 3 weeks? Almost, right? Yeah. All right, so I had some questions on the last sermon. Remember, we covered Schofield and his erroneous footnotes, which somehow have become Bible doctrine nowadays. And in doing that, I mentioned in passing that Schofield's notes and the additions that to the Bible that were made after 1967, the new Schofield, I'd mentioned that it reminded me of the scripture tampering of the Masoretic texts and St. Jerome, and also about the controversies that surround the accuracy of the Masoretic texts versus other older texts that have been found since then, or ones that were actually authored before 1611 or even before Wycliffe's Bible or Tyndale. And a great many of you out there said that you weren't as familiar with that as I thought you were, which is fine. So they said, hey, could you go in a quick crash course on what you were talking about, the controversies and the inaccuracies of earlier Bible translations, and why sometimes there are inconsistencies in the King James and other translations of the Bible versus older manuscripts. So we will be getting to a little bit of the history of the Bible. And when I was taking these notes, I did realize it was going to be 2 sermons. So the really good controversial stuff we'll actually get to next week. And I'll cover that at the end of this sermon. But we're just going to do a real quick college semester of textual criticism and biblical origins in less than an hour. So we're going to be moving quick. All right, so what is the Bible? The word Bible comes from the Greek ta biblia, which means a collection of books. And slowly over time, that word became the Bible. So ta biblia actually is, and if you look at other things, bibliography, bibliophile, books, Greek books. All right, so this collection of books, the Bible, is defined by a canon. Canon is authorized books. And that the books that we now find in today's English Bibles were actually voted on by several councils throughout history, one of which being the Nicene Council and the Council of Trent. Interestingly, some of the books that made it into the Bible or not were decided by votes or battles won. That's it. All right. Now, the Bible says that its first author was Moses. The book of Genesis, Moses begins the Bible, the book of Genesis, which is creation. Then we have Adam and Eve. Then we have the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses ends the book of Genesis with Joseph, Jacob's son, entering into Egypt. You guys know this, right? All right. Then he picks up the story with the book of Exodus, which is Egypt in Moses' day. And then from Exodus, we have Egypt, exiting Egypt, the wilderness, the giving of the law, and the preparation of the Israelites for the wilderness. Okay, so we know these things. The first 5 books of the Bible, called the Pentateuch. All right, and those are the books of Moses, sometimes referred to as the Torah. Okay, Jewish scholars refer to the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books, as the Torah. So when you hear somebody say Torah, you know that they probably are giving the authority to the Jews. Okay, but there's nothing wrong with the word Pentateuch, just Greek for 5 books. All right, so the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language of the Israelites. Okay, this is what the Old Testament was penned in. Miss Martha actually brought up this morning that the controversy of that was actually covered in this documentary, the Moses controversy. Okay, and scholars were arguing that Moses did not, in fact, write the Pentateuch because Hebrew hadn't been invented yet. Okay, so that actually watch that documentary. It's a good documentary explaining that Moses, yes, the Israelites had a written language for sure, and the first 5 books that Moses wrote were indeed written in Hebrew. So now the Jews organize the Old Testament in this way. Okay, so you have the Torah, which is the law. There's your Pentateuch there, first 5 books. And then they have the Nevi'im here, and then the Ketuvim. Okay, and you'll find those in the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. And you'll notice here that there's only 24 books there as opposed to our 39. So, and I know you guys are counting it right now, but I'm not going to give you time to count it all. All right, here. So the Jewish Bible is called the Tanakh. Okay, that's the Jewish Old Testament. Now, scholars, they will tell us that this is the Bible that's just like ours. Okay, so there's no difference between the Jewish Old Testament and our Old Testament. That's what they say. But anyway, this is how they organize it right here. law, prophets, and writings. And we'll go over a little bit more of that. But yes, that is the Jewish Bible. And you're like, yeah, but Reed, that's all well and good. But I always hear about Targums and the Talmud and Mishnahs. What's the difference? So this is the Old Testament the Jews use. Okay? So the Talmud, the Targums, and things like that, what we have to understand is, first things first, to understand Targums and the other Jewish writings, we have to understand that in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and by the time you get to Jeremiah, we're already there, we were moved to Babylon, right? You guys know your Bible history. And the Babylonian conquest, now the official language of Babylon, when we went there, was Aramaic. Okay, so when we went from our land to Babylon during the conquest, the official language of Babylon was Aramaic, and that was used in public life and administration. And Aramaic, as you can see, was used by many different peoples in many different areas of Mesopotamia here back in the day. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, Assyria used it as well, which would be Ashur, the empire. I don't know if it stretches all the way back to the Akkadians. I'll have to check. Anyway, so we're here, and then remember Daniel. Then who took over? Persians, right? Remember this? Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. Persian King Cyrus allows Judeans, to return back. You guys know these things, okay? It's a crash course. All right, now, by the time the Israelites got back, they spoke Aramaic for the most part. Hebrew has kind of gotten transitioned out of our tongues. So it's no longer that we speak Hebrew. So the issue that may be being addressed, the fact that we were Hebrew-speaking peoples, then during the Babylonian conquest, during the time we sat over here, we spoke Aramaic. By the time we go back, Nehemiah and Ezra, the high priest, what are they doing? They're reading the book of the law. Remember that? So we'll go to Nehemiah 8:8. And you'll see that perhaps the fact that we no longer spoke Hebrew and Aramaic now is a problem. Nehemiah 8:8. Now you see he's reading the book of the law in front of the people so they may understand it, and he does have Levites there with him as he's reading this book. So they read in the book and the law of God distinctly and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. Now there's a lot of debate over what exactly this verse means, but what they're saying is gave the sense or expounded unto them the meaning. Okay, and scholars say it could be similar to what I do with the law, which is read the law and then tell you what that means, right? Teach you the law. That's what I do. Or it could be that gave them the sense and caused them to understand the reading because they're reading a Hebrew text to people that now speak Aramaic. And you'll see in Nehemiah that there are people that speak half in one language and half in the other. So there seemed to be a language barrier. Perhaps this is why they had to explain it to them. Okay, now, the Levites were, if you'll read the other verses here in Nehemiah 8, you'll see that the Levites assisted in the reading to aid the understanding of the law. And like I said, it's been suggested that the language barrier between Hebrew and Aramaic may have been the cause for this, okay? Now, the synagogues picked this practice up, all right? Translators stood by the priest while he read in Hebrew in the Jewish synagogues. And these translators, or turgmen, would then interpret the Hebrew into Aramaic for the people. Okay, the Jewish people have done this, and this is what they do. They'll read the book, right, and you'll see an interpreter, and the interpreter will be standing next to the guy reading the Hebrew text, and he'll be speaking in Aramaic. They say they speak Hebrew, but it's not. It's corrupted Yiddish, okay? But anyway, they'll be reading that. And interestingly enough, while I was looking this up, I was telling you guys earlier that the document they read from, if you've ever seen the rabbis do this, you guys are familiar with this, right? Okay, the document there is handwritten, and it costs $100,000, the Jewish document here. That's why you can't touch it with your finger. So they employed the use of a yod. I think it kind of looks like the Elder Wand from Harry Potter. But that's just me. And yes, they do come in right and left-handed varieties. But this yod here, this picture right here is actually a $600 yod. So you have a $600 pointer reading a $100,000 document. And just like we spoke of with the, remember with the kosher foods, I think that's more of their racket right there. So, I have a Bible that's much cheaper than that, and I can actually touch it. So anyway, the Jewish synagogues picked up this practice of having a translator next to the guy reading the text in Hebrew, okay? Now, the interpretation that was done was not done word for word. It was a narrative translation, so it was rephrased. Because while someone speaks, you wouldn't do it word for word, literally. You would have to rephrase it and give a narrative translation of what the guy's explaining. So the orations now that they did, the synagogues, the orations eventually became oral traditions known as Targum. Okay, and Targumum is the plural, so Targum. But because the translator was paraphrasing, the Targum became a sermon of sorts, okay? And over time, beginning with the Babylonian Jews, traditions allowed for the Targum to be written down. And get this, eventually they became accepted as authoritative texts and translations of the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, so you see why we were going to have a problem here in a minute. So, and here is the picture of a written down Targum. Okay, for a long time you were not allowed to write down the oral traditions. They stayed just that, oral. And over time they could write them down, and over time this became the Bible. Not the Hebrew text, Targum. And then, of course, others. The Mishnah, literally repeated study. The Mishnah is the oldest post-biblical collection of codification of the Jewish oral laws. So that's part of their religion now, you see. We don't add to our Bible. They did. Then you have the Talmud, means study or learning, and is the commentary on the Mishnah. Okay? The Babylonian Talmud was written from years 200 to 400 BC and was taken from oral and written materials from the time of Ezra. Just like I said, those oral materials were the Targum. Okay, and that's the Babylonian Talmud, right there in Nehemiah 8. That's where they got the idea. And then, of course, the Midrash. Commentaries on the Tanakh, which remember that's the Jewish Bible. Commentaries on the Jewish Bible, Midrash, early as 100, 200 BC. These are running commentaries on the Bible. And if you've ever heard Midrash, it almost is used interchangeably with like a parable or paraphrase. If you're arguing about the book of Jasher's authenticity, some people would say, oh no, that's just a Jewish Midrash. Have you ever heard that? Or a retelling of a story. So if somebody really wants to fight the authenticity of Jasher, which cannot be verified, by the way, they will call it a midrash. So in other words, it's a paraphrase of something or a commentary on something else. And it seems like, if you read enough of Jasher, it seems like it is a midrash on the Old Testament, right? It's a retelling of Old Testament stories. Not historical, necessarily. Okay, we have works like Josephus that does that. That's a historian thing. So, the interpretations, Targum, Mishnahs, Midrash. All right, now we're going to run down the timeline very quickly, okay? You guys know this one. Nebuchadnezzar, thou art that head of gold? Right? All right, so after the Persian Empire, we have who? Who comes in after Persia, immediate Persia? Greece. What's his name? Alexander the Great. We know that he is, another name for him would be the Lord of... Oh, I've forgotten. Japheth's sons. Anyway, we know that he's directly related. Darda and all them. So anyway, I'll remember it here in a second. So we have the Greek Empire. All right, so here we had Babylon, Medo-Persia. Now we've got Greece. Okay, Daniel 2. Just like with the Hebrew and Aramaic in Babylon, it's only a matter of time before the vast majority of people here speak Greek. Okay? So we're going to have a language problem again. And that's the Greek Empire. So we're going to have another need for translations of the word. All right? Because Hebrew's gone. Aramaic's no longer spoken that often. Now we're getting into Greek languages. Now this time, when the Bible, when our scriptures are translated, they're going to be written down. By the time we get to the Greek language, we're going to write those down. And this, of course, is known as the Septuagint. Okay, the Septuagint. The Septuagint was translated at the Lighthouse of Alexandria. All right. by this guy, Ptolemy Philadelphus, Pharaoh of Ptolemaic, Egypt, 284-246 BC, son of Ptolemy I, the Greek general of Alexander the Great, founded that kingdom, okay? And he wanted more books in his library at Alexandria, so he requested that some scholars translate the Bible or the scriptures, the Old Testament at the time, into Greek, all right? Now, he commissioned 72 Greek scholars to translate the scriptures into Greek. This is known as the Septuagint. And I know if you see Septuagint, meaning 70, LXX, it's a nickname for it. That's 70, we know that, 50, 10, 10, right? So meaning 70 actually refers to the 72 translators involved in translating the Pentateuch from Hebrew to Greek in the 3rd century BC. 72 is rounded down to 70, hence the Roman numeral 70. So when you hear people talk about the Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and I myself, it's the 70. It was actually 72 scholars that Philadelphus employed to do that, okay? So, now we're not going to go into all of the families of the manuscripts this morning. That is an insanely in-depth study, okay? Because we have the Samaritan family, which those documents attest to the veracity of the Samaritan Pentateuch, first 5 books. That's all the further that one went. We have the Septuagint, and we have the Masoretic, okay? And then here you'll see the timeline. Samaritan Pentateuch is way down here, Septuagint. All the way over here is the Masoretic text of AD 900, which we'll get to here in a bit. Notice that the Masoretic text, though, is much further down the timeline. Much further down the timeline. In other words, more recent than the case of the Samaritan Pentateuch, 1,300 years, and the LXX, which of course 1,100 years. So both these documents back here predate the Masoretic text by 1,300 and 1,100 years respectively. That's your takeaway from that slide right there. It's very important. All right, and we'll discuss the family of Masoretic texts in a moment. But one noticeable difference with our King James Bible and the Septuagints that we have available is that they do include the Apocrypha. They do include the Apocrypha in these books. There's several versions of what, if you check the Catholics, they'll have things. This is the list in my Septuagint. I went this in order. Some of them include 2nd Esdras, the Greek Ezra, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, Epistle of Jeremiah, Song of the Three Holy Children, Susanna. That's an interesting one. Tells you how to interrogate witnesses. Bel and the Dragon. It's another interesting one. Book of the Maccabees, sometimes they divide that into 2. That's why these lists will differ. And Prayer of Manasseh, which is sometimes included. But then you have additions to Esther, additions to Psalms, and it just depends on what. Usually it's the Catholics that put a lot more of the apocryphal books in their Bible, the Catholic Bible. But these are the ones you'll find in the Septuagint. All right. And like I said, we'll get to the Masoretic family of texts here in a bit. But before we do that, we're going to look at the 39 books of our Old Testament. Okay, now remember, we have the Jewish Bible, their Old Testament, which was 29 books, or 24. And then ours, we recognize that, right? So here we have 5 books of the law, Pentateuch, of course. We have now, in our history books, you'll see the difference, that we've split Samuel, we've split Kings, Chronicles has been split, and Ezra and Nehemiah have now been given their own books. Okay? So that's a difference there. And of course, prophecy. You get into prophecy, this book here called the 12 has been opened up, and each of the prophets gets their own book. Okay, that's the difference between the Christian Old Testament of the Christian Bible and the Tanakh, the Jewish Old Testament. So, this example that we find in our current Bibles today, King James or otherwise, this was set by the Septuagint. The King James Version Bibles followed the example set by the Septuagint when it came to the table of contents in the Old Testament, just like that, just so you know. And like I said, the 24 and 39. So I thought when I saw the numbers that they left things out. It's not really that way. We just opened it up. All right, now, we've got the Greek Septuagint. Now, what's going to happen is there's going to be a little bit of a schism in history. Right now we're in AD 330. Constantine, you know him, moves the capital of Rome to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Right? Okay, so he moves it from Rome. Constantine moves it from Rome to Constantinople. Now the Greek church in the east remained Greek-speaking. Latin over here, and you know eventually who takes over here? Who's this? Ultimate authority, Roman Catholic Church. They stay over here. So we're going to have Greek Orthodox versus Roman Catholicism here, which eventually pretty much takes over all of Europe, right? Constantinople, and these guys were competing for ecclesiastical authority, okay? Constantinople elects to stay with the Greek language, so they keep the New Testament and Septuagint. You remember the New Testament was written in Greek. Now, it won't be until the Ottoman Empire and the Turks invade that the Greek scholars from this area of the world will flee and go to Europe, Western Europe one day, and that will spark a interesting Greek thought once again, okay, in Europe during the medieval times. But for right now, all we need to know is the Greek stayed over here in the east, and west was Latin, all right? And the Bishop of Rome had supreme ecclesiastical and political authority in Rome. And like I said, the Greek Easterners and the West were competing for who had biblical authority. And in an attempt to control that, Rome actually started issuing Bibles in Latin as fast as they could to show that they were the Word, that you don't pay attention to the East. Latin Bibles is the Word, and that's what Rome did. Now, this created a big mess because these copies that they started distributing over their empire here were not standardized, and they were inconsistent from one another. So one Bible would say one thing, another thing would say the other. They're full of errors. They were still copied by hand. So this created one big mess, okay, with the Latin. So to fix this, we have Pope Damasus I. Now you know these guys? You guys familiar with St. Jerome? There he is. That's what I mentioned earlier, last sermon. Pope assigned his secretary, Jerome of Aquileia, to the task of making one single authoritative text, okay? And using the best Latin copies he had available, he made the Latin Vulgate. Okay, and Vulgate literally means the common tongue. Vulgata, to make vulgar, to make plain, open, right? Common. So yes, St. Jerome was commissioned by Pope Damasus I to have a standardized Latin Bible, and this eventually became the Latin Vulgate, about 405 AD. And he used the best copies of the Hebrew he had available at the time. And then, of course, sometime around 500 AD, we have Masoretes. You guys know these guys, right? All right, Masoretes. A group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes wanted to standardize and preserve biblical text from the original Hebrew. That was their job. Okay, and they were actually located in Tiberias, which was in Galilee. All right, and this time now, it's very important to note, very important. At this time, when the Masoretes started their work, there were no original Hebrew manuscripts available. There were no original Hebrew scripts available. Yet it is claimed that the Masoretic text is a faithful translation of the originals. Okay? Do with that what you will. But there were no originals. All right. And like we saw earlier, so when we talked about the Masoretic, here's the Masoretic text, one of the oldest whole copies of it, okay? But the oldest Masoretic text we have is from AD 900, and it's fragmented. The oldest known complete copy is the Leningrad Codex from 1008 AD. That is the oldest Masoretic text we have that's a complete one. The other one's fragmented. And we'll revisit the Masoretic text again later. Our takeaway from this is that the main source of English Bibles is the Hebrew Masoretic text, generally from the Leningrad Codex, the oldest one we've got. May have been older ones that they used earlier, but this is the only complete one we have. practically all English Bibles come from the Hebrew Masoretic text. Practically all. And you can see, and we're not going to get into the family, there's the 50 translations I could go through and tell you which ones, but here's the main ones that everyone's fairly familiar with, okay? Hebrew Masoretic, or the Masoretic text. Now, by the time we get to AD 1054, we've got a schism in Christianity, like I was saying. It was on its way, and here it is. You've got the Greek Orthodox of the East, Roman Catholic Latin of the West, okay? So, the beginnings, and we saw the beginnings of that earlier when we looked at this map, okay? So now, we've got this going on in AD 1054, and we definitely have a Latin West and a Greek East, and the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church kept the word Latin. They kept it Latin, and the problem with Latin and having the writings in Latin was that it was usually only ever understood by the clergy or the upper class. That's the problem with Latin. And that's why, to get the word to the common folk, even though we had the Vulgate, it still was not common for people to read and write in Latin. To get it to the common folk, we actually have stained glass pictures that tell stories in the churches in the medieval times. Okay, and that's so the common folk could see little sermons, and you've seen mosaics and stuff in the church. So the common folk who couldn't read, they would listen and then they could see. That's where the stained glass comes from. All right? Now, they did make woodcut prints, which was a Bible of sorts, and it was just a block of wood that they would carve Bible pages into. Looks kind of like this. Okay, and these took forever to carve out, but they were blocks of wood that they would carve out, and it's the Biblia Pauperum, literally poor man's Bible, right? 13 to 1400 AD. It's just a wood block that you could come in and see. And you see here, the wood block carving, they have narrative text boxes right here, okay? And you've got scripture quotes in word bubbles in the form of ribbons, okay? That's scripture quotes. Visuals, representations, artworks, okay, for the poor man. And then most of the time, when you look at the woodcut blocks like this, generally what's going on is, I'm not fluent in Latin, I'm sorry, but what's going on here is they with the wood blocks, they showed the common man links between Old Testament happenings and New Testament, okay? That was a big deal. They wanted people to understand what the New Covenant was and what happened, because it wasn't that far back this all went down, right? So here we have the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, and there's Pharaoh's army being swallowed up by the waters. And then a parallel of that in the New Testament, very interesting, is Jesus in the water being baptized. Remember, because of the baptism of the Israelites back in the day, and then the baptism in the New Testament. You see how they did that? Very, very interesting. Now, this should remind you with these text boxes and illustrations and word bubbles. What does that remind you of? Anybody? Comic books. That's exactly what it was. It was almost like a comic, and you can't tell me nobody out there knows who Spider-Man is. So yes, the word bubbles and all that. Anybody can see these and read them, right? And before you say it's heresy, this is Spider-Man 129, by the way, they actually make Bible comic books, and I actually have one in my office. It's made by Kingstone, Kingsgate or something. So yeah, they still do this sort of thing. And anybody can pick these up, and here it is. And once again, we had the wood block of these guys crossing the Red Sea, and then of course in our modern comics we still have the same thing. Israelites, Pharaoh's army, there's a chariot wheel popping off. Okay, just like the Bible says. So yeah, it's a comic book of sorts. Now, we're going to move on at an accelerated pace. We're going to go from 1300 AD all the way to 1611, very quickly. Crash course. First things first, we have John Wycliffe Bible, okay? Translated in English by Oxford scholar and theologian John Wycliffe. Technically, the first English Bible, okay? Technically. His translation was from the Latin Vulgate, and of course it came out in 1382. So we get our Wycliffe Bible, and it was translated from the Latin Vulgate. Very important. The Wycliffe Bible was printed small, handwritten, small. So it could be hidden, right? So it could be hidden. All right, and the common folk could read this Bible. Okay, this is English, and I did skip over a lot. We skipped over Erasmus, I know, and Middle English and the difference between the Norman Conquest and the French and English and Anglo-Saxon languages. We skipped all that. We're in English now, John Wycliffe. So we're moving quick. All right, now, these were small to hide from the authorities, okay? And because what happened is when John Wycliffe started printing these and the common folk started reading it, they got the idea somehow that authority comes from God and not the church. And of course, this was a big problem in England. And that led to much persecution of the Christians from the Catholic authorities and the monarch that upheld it, okay? So that's why they were made small. And then, of course, by 1414, revolts had begun and led the church to outlaw the English Bible and declare its publication an act of heresy punishable by death by 1414. One odd thing that you'll find in European history, England is the only country to outlaw the Bible in its own language. At this time in Europe, there were Spanish Bibles. There were French Bibles. And of course, we know Luther, Cologne, Germany, German Bible. It was only England that outlawed that Bible in English. Only England. All right? Very odd. But in spite of, actually, believe it or not, in spite of all the persecution, Wycliffe actually escaped martyrdom. Okay, he did. He died a natural death in 1384 at the age of 64 and is buried in Lutterworth, England. Okay, so he was not martyred. His Bible was intended for the common folk, not just clergy and scholars. Wycliffe's main goal was he wanted the Bible to be understood. That's what he wanted. All right, and if you look at the preface of the Wycliffe Bible, you kind of get the idea at the time. God grant us all grace to know well and keep well the Holy Writ and suffer joyfully some pains for it at the last. A little climate of the persecution of the English back in the day, just to get that book in their hands. It's a very fascinating study, very. And one oddity that's found in the Wycliffe Bible that is still with us today. This I don't know if you guys knew this. I certainly didn't. Jacob, right? You heard of this? Okay. Jacob, Hebrew, Yaakov, Latin, Jacobus, right? You guys know this? Okay. In the Old Testament, Jacobus is Jacob. In the New Testament, Jacobus is Jacob. Okay? Not a big deal. But James is not in the New Testament scripts. James is not a name found in the New Testament. Right? In the New Testament today, Jacobus is translated to James. Right? I'm like, oh, wait a second, Reed. There's the word Jacob in our Bible. Yes, you're right. In our Bibles today, the Old Testament patriarch is called Jacob, and rightly so. When referencing the Old Testament patriarch in the New Testament, he is Jacob. But when you run into this word in the New Testament otherwise, it's translated James, as in the apostle and brother to Jesus, right? And the apostle and brother of John, right? James, everybody knows James. It's properly translated Jacob in the Old Testament and when referencing the patriarch, Jacob, in the New Testament. But no one knows why. In reference to other people named Jacob in the New Testament, it's changed to James. And this started in the Wycliffe Bible and never got corrected. So, when we read, and after 6 days Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, that's how we read it. The original translation reads, taketh Peter, Jacob, and John his brother. That's right. That's the correct translation of the New Testament, believe it or not. So we have the book of Jacob, not James. James does not exist in the New Testament. Jacob. And you wonder why Jacob's all over the Old Testament, and all of a sudden, by the time we get to the New Testament, the famous and popular name Jacob just drops off. You never hear it again. So it's James, a servant of God, and the Lord Jesus Christ to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. And that makes a little more sense. Now, this has created quite a little bit of a controversy, okay, obviously. Nobody dares change James back to Jacob the way it's supposed to be, because, Bible translations and translators are known to be very conservative about those kinds of things and fairly sensitive about it. And the controversy surrounding it is that I went and I said, well, what's the big deal? Like, Jacob, James, everybody knows. But no, that is a mistranslation that never got corrected. Never got corrected. It is actually Jacob. So now some Jewish people, they want it changed. And this is their claim. When I was teaching a course, this is from a Jewish professor. When I was teaching a course on the New Testament general letters, Hebrews through Jude, I began by introducing the book of Jacob, also known as the book of James. Students were perplexed until they learned that Jacob is the proper translation of the Greek name Jacobos. One student wrote later that knowing this turned my understanding to the writing upside down. Right? Another observed that with the name change, from Jacob to James, with the name change, the loss of Jewish lineage occurs. Okay, so this is why the Jewish people want it changed. James's Jewish cultural background is minimized. James's Jewish cultural background is minimized by having that mistranslation in our Bible. Okay, and this is one of the controversies, which is not really a controversy, because I'm like, well, there is no Jewish cultural background to James to begin with, right? So I'm not defending that. And everybody, and they even say, for the Jewish literary heritage is muddled. The book of Jacob, i.e. the book of James, is addressed to the 12 tribes of the diaspora, or scattered abroad, right? And full of references and allusions to the Torah and wisdom literature in the Jewish Bible. Scholars consider James the most Jewish book in the New Testament. Its genre is considered to be a diaspora letter like Jeremiah 29, and apocryphal works like the Epistle of Jeremiah, Maccabees, and the Apocalypse of Baruch. So you see, when you change the name James back to Jacob like it's supposed to be, the Jewish people say, that's right, now we can show our Jewish lineage. Two, now that it's, and you're like, well, why do they care what's in the New Testament, right? Because they won't read the New Testament. Well, now you see, if we need to express Jacob's Jewish heritage, he no longer belongs in the New Testament either. Where does he go? Well, according to this, right next to Jeremiah in the apocalyptic writings of the Apocrypha. Because then they can claim it. They're never going to claim it as long as it's over here in the New Testament. I know that. You know that. And it's the most Jewish book in it's interesting, they call it the most Jewish book in the Bible because of that line there. 12 tribes scattered abroad, which modern ministers don't have no clue what to do with. Now, apparently the Jewish people do, because this is the most Jewish book in the Bible, right? And if we don't change that, Jacob's Jewish heritage is lost, because the Jacob patriarch was Jewish too, right? Not Hebrew, right? So they're dead wrong. But I just thought that was interesting. It's not faith-shaking to me. I just thought it was an interesting thing. Never got corrected. And of course now, you're kind of like, if it ain't broke, and you can't, nobody has the authority to change it back now, right? Can you imagine what that would start? Anyway, just something interesting. And of course, after Wycliffe, we have the technological advance of, anybody? I did forget to tell you. Other languages here, it's only the English Bible that has this error. Only English. Go to the Spanish Bible of, 1569. Jacobo, siervo de Dios y del Señor Jesucristo. Right? So that's correct. The Spanish translation of the Bible, and this one is from 1569, got it correct. So in the Spanish, you go and read it in Spanish, and it is Jacob, not James. It's only the English Bible that got it mixed up. Interesting, isn't it? Okay, now after Wycliffe, what do we have? Right? Gutenberg Press. Johann Gutenberg, right? Famous. Interesting, this guy, he's a fellow Israelite and built a race, right? It's interesting, this technological machine here, which was a modern marvel in his day, what was the first thing they decided to do with it? Print the Bible. Yep, sounds like an Israelite to me. 100 books are out there to print. Bible. It's the Bible. It took them like 20 years to get it right, too. Moving the type and all, removable type. Crazy. I watched a whole documentary just on this. Little cram session. So, Johann Gutenberg, first printed Bible, 1455. Still with us today. Right? It's in the Smithsonian, I think. Right? Oh, okay. Museum of the Bible, Europe. So yes, there's more than one, but yes, 1455 Gutenberg Bible came out, famous Bible. All right, and up until now, we know, up until this time, Bibles were handwritten. Very, very expensive. Took years to get a Bible, if you're rich enough. As a matter of fact, when they came out, they would chain them to the pulpits, and they had an admonition above the Bible that told people one at a time, orderly to read it, and be quiet so we can have a sermon and conduct church. And people get so excited there was a Bible out there, they'd start reading it, and then they give expositions on the Bible. So they actually had an admonition above the printed Bibles to tell people to be quiet while reading the Bible. It's how excited the God's people were to get this. You don't find the Jews clamoring over this Bible in churches, do you? And yet it's their book. They're the chosen. Okay. All right, now it was printed in Latin, so it came from the Latin Vulgate, Gutenberg Bible. Okay. Next up, we got William Tyndale. If you want to read all about him, you can. He was martyred. William Tyndale. If English Christians possessed the Holy Scriptures in their own tongue, they could of themselves withstand these attacks against Christianity. Christians versus Catholics, these attacks. Without the Bible, it is impossible to establish the people in truth. Christians must read the New Testament for themselves in their own tongue. He knew that was important for God's people. That was his mission, and he died doing it. This during the reign of King Henry VIII. Okay? Now, he also said this, if God spare my life, I will take care that ere many years the boy that driveth the plow shall know more of the Scripture than thou dost, when he got into an argument in the Catholic Church. His goal was to get a book in the hands of everybody, even on down to the lowliest plowboy. That was his mission. He was strangled at the stake and then burned. Before he was strangled, he said, God opened the eyes of the king, King Henry VIII. All right, so by the time, and actually he did, God answered that prayer. King Henry VIII actually authorized the distribution of Bibles later. Then he died, and Queen Mary took over, Bloody Mary. She then flipped it over turned over the country back to Roman Catholicism. A lot of them fled, right? Then Queen Mary died. Next up, Elizabeth I, right? And that's why we have the Geneva Bible. Printed in Geneva, because at the time we couldn't print in England. That's all. 1560. We fled because Roman Catholicism took over under Queen Mary. Geneva was printed in Geneva. Okay. And actually, you guys know this one. Pilgrim Bible. The Pilgrims didn't trust the 1611 because they didn't trust the king. And King James did make sure that there were some words changed so that the Pilgrims wouldn't think so badly of him. So you won't find the word tyrant in the King James Version. You will not find it. Okay? But yes, the Pilgrims didn't trust King James, so they went with the Geneva Bible. Because by the time they came over here, 1560, 1611, the 1611's out. Why didn't they take the newest edition? They took to Geneva. They trusted it over the king. All right, so just a little FYI. Now, from here we have a very quick timeline because we're not going through everybody. We'll touch on these next week. William Tyndale, Coverdale Bible, Matthew Bible, Great Bible. Great Bible because of its size. Clergy wanted a big one to read. All right? So the printing paper was big and it got to be very expensive. The bigger the paper, the more expense. Bishop's Bible, the official Bible of the Church of England, it had some problems. And then the King James of 1611, the King James Standard, what became the standard. And then, of course, we know that the King James was at 1792 is when it was the King James. Right? And the people are like, oh, yeah, but there's like 472, 400 something changes in it. Most of that's punctuation. Okay, not a big deal. Then we have the Geneva Bible, of course, Wycliffe, and this one was done in Europe, in Paris, because even though we had printing presses, they were not allowed to be used in England for the Bible. So we had to go to France, and they let us use theirs. Okay. Now, and there's another timeline here. So yeah, we've got Wycliffe, Tyndale, Miles Coverdale that pretty much finished Tyndale's work. And we've got Thompson Matthews, that's a pseudonym, John Rogers, because, printing the Bible was a dangerous job. Great Bible because of its size, Geneva Bible, Pilgrim Bible, Bishop's Bible, King James Authorized, and yes, 1769, the Blayney version. Benjamin Blayney, an Oxford-trained linguist, is best known for the revision of the King James in 1769. The vast majority of modern King James Bibles sold today are not the original 1611, but versions of the later Blayney revision. So that's your King James. It's not just the 1611 with a different font that we have here, just so you know. All right, so official source materials of the King James. This is where it gets this very important, which I know we skipped. For the New Testament, we use the Textus Receptus, compiled by Erasmus, scholar down in Rome. They had a little race to see who could get the Greek Testament out quicker. There was a bishop that wanted to get it out with meticulous standards, but it was taking too long, so they got this guy to do it real quick. So the texts compiled in the Greek by Erasmus are somewhat erroneous because of them being hurried. All right, but anyway, the 1611, King James authorized these texts to be used while translating the King James. It's very important. Textus Receptus, which we got from Erasmus. And then the Old Testament, he used the Masoretic texts of the Hebrews compiled by the Masoretes. That's the King James. That was authorized texts used in the translations. He also allowed the use of with the Apocrypha, some from the Septuagint, and whatever the Septuagint didn't cover as translations, Latin Vulgate. Okay? That's okay. Apocrypha, because the Apocrypha was never written in Hebrew. None of them. Only Greek. As far as we know, we've never found a Hebrew Apocrypha original. They've always been found in Greek. That's why you see the Greeks here. You've got the Septuagint Greek, of course, LXX, and the Latin from Greek there. So yeah, that's why you won't see a Hebrew Apocrypha. And then, of course, with King James, 1611, these Bibles he could authorize to be used to reference and assist the translators, okay, just so you know. So like we said, every single one of these has roots in the Textus Receptus from Erasmus's Greek and the Masoretic text by the Masoretes, okay, every single one of these. And there is evidence, scholars believe, that they were influenced somewhat by the Taverner's Bible and the New Testament of the Douay-Rheims Bible, which is the one that came out of Paris during the printing press days. They're not sure if those played a part in the 1611, but they feel like they could have or influenced it somewhat. And like I said, our takeaway here is that all of these translations, practically every English Bible comes from the Hebrew Masoretic texts, translations found from those. So, and we'll touch on what was next week. That's about all we have now. Next week we will touch on the controversies now, that you understand where these Bibles are, where they came from, the Septuagint, which I know it's a basic crash course. We'll touch on these in more depth next week. But for now, you understand this. So next week we're going to start what was added and subtracted, the differences. It's going to get, Pastor Reed's going to get himself in trouble again because I'm going to lay myself in hot water telling you what is and what isn't in the Bible or the original texts, like that James-Jacob deal, right? Very interesting. I didn't know that. I found out a whole lot of things. So, what was added and subtracted? What do we lose in the Pentateuch from the LXX to the King James and the Textus Receptus from Erasmus? There's some things missing, interesting things missing. And it turns on its head a lot of accepted doctrines of today. Very much so. Very much so. All right, so everything from biblical historical timelines, they're going to be messed up now. Chronologies in the Bible. The role of women in the early church changes when we start looking at the other texts. The New Testament church, and then doctrines that are generally accepted doctrines, such as the Trinity. They start coming up, and I'm like, okay, so we're going to have to look when we compare these texts. The Great Pyramids is going to come up. So be ready for that. We're also going to see, is the earth 6,000 years old? Right? This is going to be affected by what the King James says or not. What else? Noah's Ark. What happened there? This is actually the, you recognize this? Answers in Genesis? Right, so they get that wrong. But yes, looking into the original manuscripts is going to change these things. Goliath, not so tall anymore. Right? Check the manuscripts. We're going to have to learn about these guys, so do your homework. This guy, Flavius Josephus, 1st century. Right? We're going to look at him. Right here. Eusebius, 2nd century church. So we've got Josephus. Read up on these before next week. I would suggest history, antiquities of the Jews. Eusebius, ecclesiastical histories. Check these out. You're going to have to do these because you're going to be lost next week. Check this guy out. Everybody knows him, right? Famous guy. Julius Africanus, 3rd century church father. This guy's very important. And then, of course, this guy over here is Theophilus of not antiquity, Theophilus of Antioch. Theophilus of Antioch, okay? And he is a 4th century church father. So we're going to need witnesses from 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century A.D. church fathers and historians, because they will help us out, and they're going to tell us, yeah, read Goliath. Yeah, read Noah's Ark, where it was, when it was. Yeah, Earth, actually closer to 7,000 years, much to the chagrin of Ken Ham. And then, of course, the Great Pyramid Khufu. Is there legitimate reasons to be looking for water damage on this pyramid? Is there? Well, these guys will answer these questions. They'll help us answer these. A little bit of gumshoeing and homework and stuff, and we'll check it out, because you're not going to find these in the everyday sources. We have to go back to these guys. So, and it's very interesting when you start comparing manuscripts and stuff, things start to change, maybe controversial. I now, for like Jacob and James, I don't think that's a controversial thing. I think that's great. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not taking away or causing anybody to doubt the authority of the scriptures. I myself use the King James. I see no problem with them. But if there's something that's been changed and something we need to understand differently, I'd like to know what's been changed, but more importantly to me, why. I'd like to establish motive on why these changes were made. And I think kingdom ministers can find that motive because they're the ones looking. All right? So brush up on these guys. And then, of course, bring your copy of the Septuagint with you next week if you have one. It doesn't matter. I would suggest a copy of each. So I've got the Brenton's translation, which employs the use of the Codex Vaticanus. Okay? And then I also have the official Orthodox version, which employs the use of the Alexandrian Codex. Okay, so you'll need both, because there's foolish pastors out there that forget that there are 2 codexes for the Septuagint. Depending on which one you go, Methuselah is way too old, right? So that's one thing we'll discuss, because one Septuagint seems to make Methuselah survive the flood by 14 years, and one Septuagint makes him die 6 years before it happens. What's going on here? Right? Either Methuselah was a really good swimmer or he stowed away on the ark. Right? Or that we've got something wrong. Right? We're going to go into the early history of the Mezorites once again. We're going to revisit why and how they made Jesus out to be a heretic, because all Jews know Jesus can't be a high priest. He's not Levitical. Right? And they use the Masoretic text to prove it. Well, I can use the Septuagint to prove otherwise. Why would they care about? We'll get to it, I promise. So anyway, yes, bring your copy of these. We're going to be referencing them. If not, I'll have them up on the screen. And yeah, that's all we have for today. So we'll bring your thinking caps next week and read up on the books. And also, for more reading, if you want to know about what we're reading, I would suggest these books were my go-to. Sir Frederick Kenyon, pretty much the authority on the Bible and modern scholarship, a little thin book. The Story of the Bible. If you're looking for the DDCs, you'll be in 240.4. Okay? Read Kenyon's works. Another one, anything by Smythe. Smythe did a lot of authoritative works on the early histories of the Bible. And now this was before This will be before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran, those play an important part on our ancient texts. Here's a little spoiler alert. The Dead Sea Scrolls never side with the Masoretic texts. They just don't. All right. Ancient Documents in the Modern Bible by Smythe. Check it out. That's what I'm talking about. Also, you understand we are getting into some apologetics, polemics, and textual criticisms of the Bible. So we're automatically in King James only or not. Okay, I did take the time to read these books. This is Reed Benson's book, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, Why the King James Bible is a Single Standard for English People. Okay, I read that. It's not, just a second, I dropped my book. It's not so much that it's King James only, which tends to be a little bit of a clique. Okay, his book is not about that, and I'm not saying that it's a bad one, but you understand, when I start talking about the King James or not, people are going to accuse me of being anti-King James only. I'm not. I've read their books, I see their sides, I understand their sides, and they make valid points. I get that. We should be teaching from them because it's the only one linked to a concordance, right? All right, now, if you try to find out what happened to the Bible in books such as these, modern books, be careful, because when you read Reader's Digest, the authorities they give everybody every time is the Jewish rabbis. So when you get into modern books like this, it's the Jewish rabbis that tell us what happened and how, and that they didn't mess with the Bible. Okay? But yeah, be careful with those. Like so I said, go with Smythe, go with Kenyon. Do the research. These guys dug them up. They found the documents. They tell you what they say. Don't let the Jewish rabbis tell you what they found and say they found. Do the homework. Because when you compare the manuscripts like I've done over the last 2 weeks, you'll find out some very shocking things. All right, that's all we have for today.